My son told everyone I was abusive, so I released the security footage that showed who the real monster was. The first time I installed security cameras in my house, I thought I was being paranoid. My neighborhood had been experiencing break-ins, and my ex-wife kept insisting that our 16-year-old son was acting out because he felt unsafe. I figured having cameras would give everyone peace of mind, and maybe catch any actual intruders if they showed up. Little did I know those cameras would end up saving my reputation and possibly my freedom. My son had been living with me full-time for about 8 months after his mother moved 3 states away for work. The adjustment was rough for both of us, but I thought we were making progress. He had his moody teenager moments, sure, but what kid doesn't at that age? The problem started when he began staying out later than his curfew. I'd set reasonable boundaries: home by 10 on school nights, midnight on weekends, but he'd roll in at 2 or 3 in the morning reeking of cigarettes and sometimes alcohol. When I'd confront him about it, he'd get defensive and storm off to his room, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. I tried different approaches to connect with him. Some nights I'd wait up and try to have calm conversations about responsibility and consequences. Other times I'd leave notes on his desk explaining why I was worried and how his choices affected both of us. I even offered to drive him places myself, so he wouldn't have to rely on friends who might be making poor decisions. Nothing seemed to work, and his behavior kept escalating. He started skipping classes, and his grades dropped from mostly A's and B's to barely passing. His mother would call during these episodes, and I could hear the frustration in her voice as she tried to give advice from hundreds of miles away. She suggested maybe he needed more structure, or maybe I was being too strict, or maybe we should consider counseling. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in October. He'd been out since after school, hadn't answered any of my texts, and walked through the door at almost 4 in the morning. I was sitting in the living room waiting for him, and I could immediately tell something was different. He was more agitated than usual, his eyes were bloodshot, and he kept fidgeting with his phone. I asked him where he'd been, and he mumbled something about being at a friend's house studying. When I pointed out that it was almost dawn and asked why he hadn't called, he exploded. He started yelling about how I was controlling and paranoid, how I didn't trust him, and how living with me was ruining his life. The volume and intensity caught me completely off guard. I tried to stay calm and asked him to lower his voice so we could talk through whatever was bothering him. That's when he completely lost it. He started throwing things, first his backpack, then a magazine from the coffee table, then one of my coffee mugs that was sitting nearby. The mug shattered against the wall, leaving a dark stain on the white paint. I stood up and told him that was enough, that we needed to take a break and talk about this tomorrow when we were both calmer. He responded by grabbing a framed photo from the side table and hurling it across the room. The glass exploded everywhere, and I realized the situation was getting dangerous. I raised my voice for the first time and told him to stop destroying the house and go to his room. He looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before: pure hatred mixed with something that looked almost like satisfaction. Then he picked up a lamp and threw it at the wall so hard that it left a dent in the drywall. I moved toward him, not to hurt him, but to try to physically guide him away from anything else he could break. As soon as I got within arm's reach, he started swinging at me. His fists connected with my chest and shoulder, and I had to grab his wrists to keep him from hitting my face. I was shocked by how strong he'd gotten and how genuinely violent he was being. The whole thing probably lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. I managed to get him to his room and told him we'd figure this out in the morning, but I needed him to stay put and cool down. He slammed his door so hard that a picture fell off the wall in the hallway, and I could hear him throwing things around in there for another 10 minutes. I spent the rest of the night cleaning up broken glass and wondering what had gone so wrong. I kept replaying the confrontation in my head, trying to figure out if I'd handled it poorly or if there was something I could have done differently. The lamp was beyond repair, and I had to patch the holes in the wall before the damage got worse. The next morning, he acted like nothing had happened. He came downstairs, grabbed a piece of toast, and headed for the door like it was any other day. When I tried to bring up the previous night, he just shrugged and said he didn't remember much because he was tired. I told him we needed to establish some new rules and consequences, and he nodded along like he was listening, but I could tell his mind was elsewhere. Over the next few weeks, things seemed to improve slightly. He was still testing boundaries, but the violent outburst hadn't repeated itself. I started to think maybe it was just a one-time thing, a perfect storm of teenage hormones and stress. I even considered that maybe I had been too strict, and decided to give him a little more freedom to show that I trusted him. That decision turned out to be a massive mistake. The improved behavior was apparently just him getting better at hiding things. I started noticing small items missing from around the house. Nothing major, just things like loose change from my dresser, gift cards I'd been saving, and even some of my old electronics from the garage. When I asked him about it, he always had explanations that seemed plausible enough. The missing items escalated to missing money. I kept some cash in my desk drawer for emergencies and tips, and I started noticing that 20s would disappear and be replaced with smaller bills, like someone was making change. When I confronted him about it, he got defensive and accused me of not trusting him, which made me feel guilty for even bringing it up. Around this time, I started getting calls from school more frequently. Not just about his grades, which were still struggling, but about his behavior. He'd been caught in areas where students weren't supposed to be, had been disrespectful to teachers, and had gotten into a shouting match with another student that nearly turned physical. Each time, he'd come home and tell me a completely different version of events that made him look like the victim. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. Every story had two sides, and I couldn't tell which version was true anymore. His mother was getting frustrated with me, suggesting that maybe I wasn't cut out for full-time parenting, and I was beginning to wonder if she was right. I'd always thought I was a pretty good father during our weekend visits, but this was entirely different. The security cameras had been recording everything this whole time, but I'd honestly forgotten about them. They were just quietly doing their job, storing footage on a hard drive in my closet. It wasn't until everything fell apart that I remembered they existed, and by then it was almost too late. The explosion happened on a Saturday morning in November. I'd been out running errands for a couple of hours and came home to find the house in complete chaos. The living room looked like a tornado had hit it. Furniture was overturned, books were scattered everywhere, and there were holes punched in multiple walls. My first thought was that we'd been robbed, and my second thought was panic about where my son was. I called out for him and heard him yelling from his room. When I got upstairs, I found him sitting on his bed with his head in his hands, and he looked up at me with tears streaming down his face. He immediately started telling me about how these guys had broken into the house looking for me, how they'd threatened him and torn the place apart, and how scared he'd been. My heart broke for him and I immediately called the police. While we waited for them to arrive, he gave me more details about these mysterious intruders. He described them as older teenagers, said they'd been looking for money I supposedly owed someone, and claimed they'd threatened to come back if I didn't pay up. None of it made sense to me, but he seemed genuinely traumatized. The police took our statements and looked around the house, but something about the scene didn't seem right to them. One of the officers mentioned that it was strange how the damage was so localized to the main living areas, and another pointed out that nothing valuable seemed to be missing. They said they'd file a report, but I could tell they weren't entirely convinced. After they left, I helped my son clean up the mess and tried to comfort him. He kept talking about how unsafe he felt, and how maybe he should go live with his mother until this got sorted out. I felt terrible that he'd been put in that position, and started making arrangements to send him to her place for a while. That night I couldn't sleep. Something about the whole situation kept nagging at me, but I couldn't put my finger on what was wrong. I kept thinking about the police officers' reactions, and trying to remember if I'd noticed anything unusual when I first walked in. Around 3 in the morning, I remembered the security cameras. I went to my closet and pulled out the hard drive, then spent the next hour figuring out how to access the footage. What I saw made my blood run cold. The cameras had captured everything, and there were no intruders. The destruction was entirely my son's doing, and it was methodical and deliberate. The footage showed him waiting about 20 minutes after I left, then systematically destroying the living room. He'd punched holes in the walls, thrown furniture around, and even broken some of my personal belongings that had sentimental value. But the most chilling part was his demeanor throughout the whole thing. He wasn't angry or out of control, he was calm and focused, like he was following a plan. After finishing the destruction, the cameras showed him going upstairs and then apparently working on his story. He'd even practiced his emotional reaction, running through different versions of tears and trauma. When he heard my car in the driveway, he'd quickly gotten into position and started his performance. I sat in my dark office staring at the footage until sunrise, trying to process what I just witnessed. This wasn't just typical teenage rebellion or acting out. This was calculated deception on a level I'd never imagined. I started thinking back over all the recent incidents and wondering how much of what I'd believed about my son was actually true. The next morning, I confronted him with the footage. His reaction was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Instead of shame or remorse, he became furious that I'd been recording him. He accused me of violating his privacy and being a controlling parent who didn't trust his own child. When I pointed out that the cameras had just proven he'd lied about something serious, he shifted tactics. He started crying and saying he'd only destroyed the house because he was angry about how I'd been treating him. He claimed he'd been afraid to tell me the truth because I was so controlling and intimidating. He said he'd made up the story about intruders because he thought I'd be more sympathetic to him being a victim than being honest about his feelings. I wanted to believe this version, and part of me almost did. It would have been so much easier to accept that this was just a cry for help from a confused teenager. But watching the footage again, I could see that his actions weren't driven by emotion. They were too calculated and deliberate. This wasn't a moment of rage, it was a planned event. Over the next few days, I started reviewing more of the archived footage from the previous weeks. What I discovered was even more disturbing. The cameras had captured him bringing strangers into the house while I was at work, going through my personal belongings when I wasn't around, and even having friends over who were clearly under the influence of something. One particularly unsettling clip showed him and two other kids going through my desk drawers and filing cabinets. They were looking for something specific, and I watched them photograph documents and papers. Another clip showed him letting someone into the house at 2 in the morning, and they'd spent hours in my garage going through boxes of stored items. I realized that the missing money and small items weren't just typical teenage stealing. He was systematically going through my personal property and possibly sharing information about my finances and schedule with people I'd never met. The violation felt deeper than just the lying. It felt like a complete betrayal of trust and safety. When I confronted him about this additional footage, his response was to completely flip the script. He started claiming that I was the one who was abusive and controlling, that I'd been emotionally manipulating him for months, and that the cameras were proof of my obsessive and paranoid behavior. He said he'd only been acting out because he felt trapped and scared. Within hours, he'd called his mother and given her a completely different version of events. According to him, I'd been verbally abusive for months. The cameras were part of a pattern of controlling behavior, and he'd been too afraid to tell anyone until now. He claimed that I'd threatened him when he tried to stand up for himself, and that he'd been walking on eggshells trying not to set me off. His mother called me that evening, and I could hear the concern and anger in her voice. She said she'd always had reservations about him living with me full-time, and this confirmed her worst fears. She accused me of being unable to handle the responsibility of raising a teenager, and demanded that he be sent to her immediately. I tried to explain about the footage and what had really been happening, but she cut me off. She said that installing cameras to spy on my own child was evidence of the controlling behavior he'd described. She couldn't understand why I would do something so invasive and paranoid unless I was trying to intimidate him into submission. The conversation went in circles for over an hour. Every time I tried to explain the timeline of events or mention specific incidents, she had a counter-explanation that painted me as the villain. She'd apparently been talking to him regularly about his concerns, and he'd been building this narrative of abuse and control for weeks. By the end of the call, she'd made arrangements to drive down and pick him up within the next few days. She said she needed to remove him from what was clearly a toxic situation, and that we'd need to discuss long-term custody arrangements through lawyers. The implication was clear. She thought I was an unfit parent who had been emotionally abusing my son. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen feeling completely defeated. In less than 24 hours, I'd gone from being a concerned father trying to help his troubled teenager to being labeled as an abusive parent who couldn't be trusted. The truth was sitting on a hard drive in my closet, but apparently nobody wanted to hear it. The next morning, I woke up to discover that the situation had gotten much worse overnight. My son had apparently been busy on social media, sharing his version of events with friends and family. My phone was buzzing with concerned messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in months, all asking if the stories about me were true. The narrative he'd crafted was sophisticated and damaging. According to his posts, I'd been emotionally abusive for months, using the cameras to intimidate and control him. He described feeling like a prisoner in his own home, afraid to make any mistakes because I was always watching and waiting to punish him. He painted himself as a victim who'd finally found the courage to speak up about his situation. What made it particularly effective was how he'd mixed in just enough truth to make it believable. He mentioned real incidents where I'd been frustrated or raised my voice, but he'd reframed them as examples of my abusive behavior. He described the night he destroyed the living room as me having a violent outburst that had left him terrified and traumatized. The responses from friends and family were overwhelmingly supportive of him and critical of me. People were praising him for his bravery in speaking out, sharing resources for abuse victims, and expressing disappointment in me for putting him through such trauma. Several relatives mentioned that they'd always worried about my temper and were glad he'd finally gotten help. I spent the morning trying to respond to messages and calls, but I quickly realized that defending myself was just making things worse. Every explanation I offered sounded like typical abuser behavior, denying the victim's experience, making excuses, and trying to control the narrative. The more I tried to explain, the more guilty I appeared. My ex-wife arrived that afternoon with a stern expression and a determination to get our son out of what she saw as a dangerous situation. She barely spoke to me, focusing entirely on helping him pack his belongings and offering emotional support. I could hear them talking in his room, and it was clear that she believed every word of his story. When they were ready to leave, she pulled me aside for a conversation that was equal parts heartbreaking and infuriating. She told me that she'd suspected something was wrong for weeks based on her phone calls with him, but she'd hoped I would figure things out on my own. She said his descriptions of my behavior matched patterns she'd noticed during our marriage, and she regretted not intervening sooner. I tried one more time to explain about the security footage and what it actually showed, but she dismissed it as more evidence of my controlling behavior. She said that secretly recording a teenager was a violation of privacy and trust, and that using the footage to justify my actions was manipulative and wrong. She couldn't understand why I would do something so invasive unless I was trying to intimidate him. As they loaded his belongings into her car, I realized that I was losing more than just my relationship with my son. The story he'd created was spreading through our extended family and social circles, and my reputation was being destroyed in real time. People who had known me for years were beginning to question everything they thought they knew about me. That evening, I sat alone in my house, surrounded by the evidence of what had really happened. The security footage was crystal clear, showing exactly who had been lying and who had been telling the truth. But somehow, the actual facts seemed to matter less than the narrative that had been constructed around them. I spent the next few weeks in a strange kind of limbo. My son was gone, my relationship with my ex-wife was more strained than ever, and I was getting fewer and fewer calls from friends and family members. The story of my alleged abuse had taken on a life of its own, and I was starting to feel like there was no way to fight back against it. The breaking point came when I received a call from my workplace. Someone had apparently contacted them with concerns about my behavior at home, suggesting that if I was abusive to my family, I might not be suitable for my position. While they couldn't take any formal action based on rumors, they wanted to have a conversation about the situation and how it might affect my professional relationships. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I spent hours editing together the most relevant clips from the security footage, creating a timeline that showed exactly what had happened over the past few months. The video was long and detailed, but it told a complete story that was impossible to misinterpret. I uploaded the compilation to a private video sharing platform and sent the link to my ex-wife with a message explaining that I understood why she'd believed our son's story, but that I needed her to see the truth before making any permanent decisions about custody or our family relationships. I asked her to watch the entire video before responding. Her response came 3 days later, and it was unlike anything I'd expected. She called me in tears, apologizing for not believing me and expressing shock at what the footage had revealed. She said she'd watched it multiple times, trying to find some explanation that would make sense of what she was seeing, but there was no denying the reality of the situation. She admitted that she'd been so focused on supporting our son that she'd never considered the possibility that he might be lying about such serious accusations. She said the footage had forced her to reconsider not just recent events, but patterns of behavior she'd noticed over the years that she'd dismissed as typical teenager stuff. The conversation was difficult for both of us. She felt guilty for not believing me, and I felt terrible that the situation had gotten so out of control. We talked for hours about how to move forward, what this meant for our son, and how to address the damage that had been done to our family relationships. Together, we decided that the footage needed to be shared more widely. The story of my alleged abuse had spread through our social circles, and the only way to counteract it was with the truth. We carefully selected the most relevant clips, and created a shorter version that told the essential story without being overly invasive or embarrassing. The response to the video was immediate and dramatic. People who had been cold and distant suddenly started reaching out with apologies and support. Family members who had believed the worst about me were shocked and ashamed of their reactions. Friends who had been avoiding me began calling to express their regret and offer help. But the most important reaction came from my son himself. When he realized that the footage had been shared and that his story was falling apart, he initially tried to double down on his claims. He insisted that the cameras had been edited or manipulated, that the footage didn't show the full context, and that I was still the real victim in the situation. However, as more people saw the evidence and began questioning his version of events, his story started to crumble. The sophisticated narrative he'd constructed couldn't hold up against the clear documentation of what had actually happened. Within a week, he was facing the reality that his lies had been exposed, and that he'd damaged relationships with people who had cared about him. The fallout was significant for him. Friends who had supported him during his supposed crisis felt betrayed and manipulated. Teachers and school counselors who had been concerned about his home situation began to understand that he'd been lying about his circumstances. Extended family members who had offered him support and resources felt used and deceived. My ex-wife had to have several difficult conversations with him about the seriousness of his accusations and the damage they'd caused. She explained that falsely accusing someone of abuse wasn't just wrong. It was harmful to real victims and could have destroyed my life and career. She made it clear that there would be serious consequences for his behavior. The process of rebuilding trust and relationships was slow and complicated. My son eventually admitted that he'd lied about the abuse, but he struggled to take full responsibility for his actions. He claimed that he'd felt trapped and desperate, that he'd been afraid of getting in trouble for his real behavior, and that the lies had gotten out of control before he could stop them. While I appreciated his eventual honesty, I realized that the damage to our relationship was profound. The level of deception and manipulation he displayed wasn't just typical teenage rebellion. It showed a capacity for calculated dishonesty that was deeply troubling. The fact that he'd been willing to destroy my reputation and relationships to avoid consequences for his behavior was something I couldn't easily forgive or forget. The security footage had saved me from a nightmare scenario, but it had also revealed a truth about my son that was almost as painful as the false accusations. I'd raised a child who was capable of sophisticated deception and manipulation, who was willing to destroy other people's lives to protect himself from consequences, and who had shown little remorse until he was caught. Moving forward required establishing completely new boundaries and expectations. My son couldn't return to live with me until he'd undergone counseling and demonstrated genuine understanding of what he'd done wrong. His mother and I had to work together to create accountability measures and ensure that this kind of behavior wouldn't happen again. The experience taught me that sometimes the people closest to us are capable of betrayals we never imagined possible. It also showed me the importance of documenting the truth, even when it feels paranoid or unnecessary. Those security cameras had been installed to protect against strangers, but they'd ended up protecting me from someone I'd never suspected could be a threat. The aftermath was a long process of healing and rebuilding. Some relationships were permanently damaged, and some people never fully believed my side of the story despite the evidence. But the truth had been revealed, and that was something I could build on. The footage had given me back my reputation and my future, even if it had cost me some illusions about my son. Looking back, I realized that the cameras captured more than just the events of those few months. They captured the moment when I learned that love and trust aren't always enough to protect you from the people you care about most. Sometimes you need evidence, documentation, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths about the people in your life. The story had a resolution, but not the kind I'd ever wanted. My son and I were slowly working toward rebuilding our relationship, but it would never be the same. The trust that had been broken couldn't be simply repaired. It had to be rebuilt from the ground up, with new rules and new understanding of what we were both capable of. In the end, the security footage had revealed the real monster in our house, but it wasn't the person anyone had expected. It was the betrayal, the manipulation, and the willingness to destroy other people's lives to avoid personal consequences. The cameras had caught all of it, and in doing so, they'd saved me from a fate I'd never seen coming.